Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout free by John, Kennedy, Dalia, and Crystal. I understand your team had a very early morning on that session with Dalia getting up really early. So I commend you on that, John. Thank you for facilitating this session. So I'm just going to give you the general overview, like in previous Hangouts, on your discussion. John started by kicking off question number 1 on the apathy and major underlying reasons for people not preparing, or preparedness not really being a huge focus of society generally. And even the latest report, there is a latest report from the Office of National Preparedness by FEMA. They issued a report that approximately only 16% of agencies and institutions surveyed take preparedness issues seriously. 53% is not even on the radar. So the research continues to underscore that preparedness is not huge. And so what are those critical issues? John mentioned that the preparedness cannot be reflected in daily body count, like a general everyday crime is. You have daily preoccupations with what's happening daily, so that becomes lesser of a priority, and it's very hard to get people to care about that when they have to go about their daily challenges and daily lives. The second issue being a lack of awareness and underestimation of risk, and of course the complacency and denial that we've never had to face those issues, so they are really not high on our radar. And I think, John, you mentioned that we talk about the 100-year floods, and we had 3 of them in the last 25 years, and the other issue being over-reliance on technology, so having a false sense of invulnerability, relying on levees, relying on seawall in Galveston. And with technology also, I want to mention that there are some studies that suggest that with the advent of technology, some of the societal ability, indigenous ability to assess risk is getting diminished, and some of the common knowledge or wisdom of societies and communities might be disappearing with the advent of technology. So as those systems go down, then that older processes are not in place to sort of substitute for it. Of course, fatalism and denial. We've talked about denial a lot in this course as an enemy of emergency management. Social pressures, the impact of public opinion in a community, that previous experiences, if we survived it before, we're going to be fine when it happens again. And special interests, lobbying, and corporations, that it's very hard to bring mitigation to the forefront of their political agendas. Elected officials, they are elected for certain terms, and preparedness certainly in their budgets does not give them the return on the money in a short period of time that they are in the office. And of course, the competition for public funding is a huge impediment to fostering preparedness, and generally lack of the short terms of public officials, or election terms, do not allow for strategic visioning or having long-term projects. So as policy agendas shift with new administrations, their focus shifts, and so preparedness is not one constant for different administrations. It's very difficult to show the benefits of preparedness. It's a very similar issue with prevention. How do you document, or how do you argue for a budget on preventing something you can't document what you prevented, right? So it's very hard to measure preparedness as well. And the overestimating capabilities, you mentioned that as a challenge, and the factor of apathy into preparedness, and Some other factors, recency and magnitude. And I think that there's quite a body of research on policy windows. And the policy windows, some of the theories on the policy window indicate that when you have a traumatic event such as 9/11 that created a big shift in governmental organization, the biggest since 1947 in the Department of Homeland Security. But when you have a particular traumatic event, then there's three factors that can align. One of them is public outcry. The second one is, the mediation, the media focus on the event, public outcry, pressure on those public officials, and the research. So if those three, the existing research, the public outcry, and high media highlighting of the event sort of all converge, this is the best time to formulate a policy. And unfortunately, this is where that mitigation animal comes in. That mitigation is the best suited in that policy window that happens right in the response and early recovery stages. But mitigation is generally pushed down to much later stages of emergency management cycle. It is misconstrued, and if we look at it in a linear fashion, then we never get to mitigation because, again, the daily body count, as John mentioned, we get preoccupied with things today or imminent future. So going back to those legislative issues, building codes, and so on and so forth, sort of drift to the side, and it's generally a more neglected aspect of emergency management. And so I think John also talked about a modular approach and looking at small things, not attacking all the aspects of preparedness, but actually identifying targeted capabilities such as interoperability, and working on those, has a little bit more ability to enhance certain preparedness aspects. And the question number 2 dealt with, shifts, societal shifts, as we are looking at disasters. And Dalia started a discussion on social tolerance of losses and human suffering, and how that perception of human suffering shifted. When we looked at the disasters or those big events being acts of God, there was, a more of a reliance on yourself or individual to cope with those, because there's, it's really difficult to find a culprit. However, as we are getting more involved with those, creating emergency management structures, offices of emergency management, and all those networks, and we invest capital in those, people have less tolerance to expect losses or to expect suffering. So the onus shifts their responsibility more towards the response organizations. That's why emergency management is becoming such a huge function of those, policing and, public health, and those organizations that before were a little bit more, the responsibility was not as heavy on them as it was on a society, if you will. If events are acts of God, then it's hard to blame the organizational structures. But if we're starting to look at them being anthropomorphic and humans contributing to that, then the public is going to demand more accountability. So that's certainly a new shift in perception. Americans, I think Kennedy talked about the perception of risk. We are more aware of risks, and we are getting better at assessing risks today. So people would not tolerate certain failures in risk assessments that they would have maybe tolerated during Johnstown flood and in late 1800s. Of course, the advent of internet and how the news travels and global connectedness makes people more demanding and more aware, and certainly that puts a stress on response organizations as well. So what it means for emergency management professionals, more responsibilities being thrown their way, and they have to have a deeper understanding of disaster studies, social aspects, and all those things you're going to talk about in that you talked about in this session. And they also, there's more expectation on them being experts. And this is a very interesting dynamics in emergency management. Emergency management, when FEMA was first created in the 70s, generally the people that led those organizations were practitioners with experience, and experience is huge in that domain. But they were not necessarily, education was not valued, and the body of research was not huge. So it was, sort of baptism by fire, so to speak, dealing with those events. Now that the body of knowledge is increasing, the need for educated individuals, think about technology. If you are at emergency operations center and you are dealing with predictions and simulations and modeling for plume analysis and those type of things, you require people to be very well educated in science and weather science and meteorology with flood controls and things like that. So there is a strong push on professionalization of emergency management institutions and professionals that work for them. And certainly experience still plays a big factor. And I think John talked about that there is, the experience is not an equivalent of good experience. The experience is good when it's supported by reflective practice. And that's where, education plays a big role. So we expect emergency management organizations and agencies to stress professional development, leadership, knowledge base, science base, case studies and things like that. Again, public expectations are high, and then I think that John, with respect to public expectations, what comes with it is also the ability to manage those expectations. And so the individuals in emergency management that are tasked with the accountability for those managing those events also need to understand the social aspects and the management of public expectations as well. The factors that affect preparedness and research, you mentioned most of them that were in your readings. Crystal talked about experience again, certainly a critical aspect. I think you went back to James Witt, who was under whom FEMA really went through huge leadership shifts, because he was the emergency manager that stood at the helm of and being a director of FEMA at a time during Clinton administration. But again, going back to, professional experience needs to be supported with reflective practice and, relying on research. So your lessons learned from all those different case studies are actually lessons that are becoming integrated into practice. You also talked about age and gender differences in preparedness. Certainly females, and there's research on risk-taking in females and males, and females tend to be more risk averse or risk-taking averse versus males. And certainly, in households, some research indicates that women prepare more. And they prepare more also when there are children in the families. Socioeconomic status will affect levels of preparedness. Obviously, certain adjustments, such as, go and buy a generator if you want to have energy after the power goes out. It's not certainly feasible for a lot of people. Going and investing $600 in a generator, as John said, when people have current daily needs and they have to put gas in their car to go to work, might not be a feasible adjustment for them to make. Familiarity with risks. which can be the double-edged sword because familiarity breeds contempt, right? So people that have successfully coped with certain smaller scale disasters have this sense of invulnerability because they were able to handle it well. As they grow older and they have more experiences behind their belt, they are probably they might lose that sense of proper risk assessment because they are basing it on historical data and not on predictive, looking forward. And of course, customs of social power, social influence, as new people move into certain areas, they might be dissuaded from worrying about particular risk by the subculture of that area that dealt with that risk. And I think you had a discussion on that as well. Kennedy was mentioning the money and resources and preparedness. Certainly, certain groups cannot be targeted for those resources. Also, when you're talking about preparedness strategies, that they cannot be generic, so they have to look at the nuance and complexity of communities. So not all messages are equally effective for all groups of people or all places, right? So take, for example, the new generation and the mega disaster kit call for, portable radio and batteries. Most of the millennials and up probably do not operate radios, and you probably do not change batteries in them either. So, adaptations to take into account those nuances and changes in demographics are also really important. Question number 4 dealt with some issues on community disaster resilience based on a video from Australia. And so Kennedy was talking about the challenges and self-organization, withstanding shocks and disturbances being hard, or adaptation to change being hard, lack of interest, lack of resources, lack of finances. John was talking about the fact that preparedness is really a strategic notion, so you have to be a forward thinker, this is very challenging when you take into account public officials who are elected for certain terms, and of course the priorities will change for different administrations, and political agendas as well have a lot to do with that. So that strategic visioning for preparedness is difficult when you have shifts in electoral cycles and things like that. Dalia was talking about changing demographics, and certainly they mentioned that in the Australian video. In my community, I wanted to bring that point home because it's really important in emergency management. Our communities are not as they used to be, that you have a certain community that doesn't change very much over a period of time. They are becoming more diverse. There are big population shifts. The mobility is larger. People live in more than one home during their lifespan, where it used to be different, right? So in my community, there was this big flood. I'm in River Plantation in 2001 during Tropical Storm Allison. Well, since Tropical Storm Allison 2001 and those huge ones, the string of floods that John mentioned, the 3 100-year ones, there was a relative decade and a half of smaller events, but nothing a 100-year type of event. And during that period of time, the community changed dramatically. So the new people coming in, they don't have that collective knowledge of previous events. So the way they buy their homes or the questions they ask, they are not really aware what happened here in 2001. Nobody advertises that on a billboard of a real estate agency. And some of the people that bought homes here, they were cautioned that they were flooded in Allison, maybe, but they were not, aware that there were 7 different floods in between. And so obviously, and this community used to be totally different because it was established by people in the oil industry that created it as a retreat from Houston, where now, the demographics are totally different. So, we have a lot of elderly, we have a lot of widowed people, so single elderly household. We also have linguistic diversity. Some pockets are very low socioeconomic status, and there are people that rent. There are people that purchase their homes cash in very, very vulnerable areas. So, so those changing demographics really impact that perception of risk, where there is that lack of community knowledge as well. Another challenge that you mentioned was military styles of most of the response, or the way the response organizations are run. They are run based on bureaucratic models, on the Weber concept of bureaucracy, and they have difficulty integrating the grassroots structures. And with community voice in emergency and preparedness, it's very challenging because, again, if you are looking at the fact that it's going to be your most marginalized pockets of community that are going to be the most affected, the people that are engaged are usually people that have means, that have time to participate in meetings or to go to different community groups like LEPCs or structures like that, or to interact with our public elected officials. So the people that actually should have a voice generally, those are the people that don't, because, well, they are the most marginalized by the disaster, but they also have the least means to actually be the voice of the community. So how do you engage them? How do you reach what I call the deep community, and not your usual suspects that are the drivers for preparedness? Those are people that are going to prepare ultimately themselves, and those are your 25% that think, or 16% that think about preparedness. And certainly, that's an issue. So as far as your challenges that can be identified in preparedness that are similar between Australia and the United States, is you based it on the video and on your discussions so far this semester. You talked about apathy. So, the general enemy of emergency management is societal apathy to preparedness. And John mentioned that, if the politicians and if the people don't care, then, you can create all those superstructures, and you can create a lot of bureaucracy, but you're still not getting to those grassroots nuances of communities. And of course, if they don't care, they will not seek information, they will not seek education, and they will not seek engagement. And you had really, I'm looking at my notes, you really had a good discussion on those same people get involved in a lot of different things at the community level, and then, certain voices are never heard. And those are the voices you want to hear. And this is where, the role of emergency management organizations would be to access those communities, to find strategies how to reach out to them. Also, the reliance on historical data, and we are always fighting the last war. I think that was also John's. Crystal, was looking at another similarity between US and Australia, which is also, the universal challenge in preparedness is we are dealing with uncertainty. So the issues that there is either controversial research such as ecological changes, climate changes, where not everybody is on board with the current state of knowledge. So when you have high complexity and high uncertainty, it's very hard to anchor, how to adjust and how to prioritize what you're preparing for. Kennedy, I think, went back to this whole issue of, the people that already prepare, and then the other 50% that it's not even on the radar. They are not engaged in the community planning anyway. John mentioned, socioeconomic status being a factor. You can compare whether here or United States or in Australia, if you're working 3 jobs, you're less likely to attend a meeting or a community meeting. And certainly there are some strategies, like community surveys and so on and so forth. So, you have to get creative about how you reach out to you access those inaccessible populations that are not engaged. How do you engage the public to build that community disaster resilience? You did not mention the fact that, I think one of the big issues is also that is very common is the inability to define what resilience is and how do you put together the pieces of it. So, there are all different models of resilience, and we even having a hard time today to define what a community is, right? We have communities of work, communities of practice, communities of virtual communities, and so on and so forth. So do we even have a agreed upon concept of communities in the geographical area? Does it overlap with administrative jurisdictions, or is it something different? And from there, how do you measure community resilience if you have a hard time defining a community? And the problem definition is a problem in Homeland Security. It's very similar with terrorism. So resilience is a buzzword. You had a reading on that. If we don't define it in standardized terms, then it's harder to convey to people, what priorities, what adjustments, what specific things. And then, of course, it's going to be community dependent. The next question looked at whether you think that the predominance of focus in Homeland Security has been on physical structures and critical infrastructure resilience versus societal and ecological resilience. And I think that you agreed that, there through the directives 5 and 8 and post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act and National Preparedness Strategy, they tend to focus very heavily on critical infrastructures and key resources. And how, and yet, the community issues and ecology issues are huge. You mentioned Katrina, 5 years after Katrina, the same region experienced a deep water horizon spill. There was a huge ecological issue that is still not talked about very much. We talked mostly about fixing the drilling platforms or preventing the leak or cleaning of the spill off of the surface of the water, but a lot less focus by the media, by response organizations, were on actually societal impact of industries and fisheries and people livelihoods and the ecology of the whole area and how it impacts the environment. So I agree that we do have a very strong stress on critical infrastructure that is probably very connected to our risk assessment of terrorism, prevalence of terrorism in policy making. You talked about this going back to mitigation, and I think that You mentioned that funding was much easier to get for tourism. It's much harder to get people to think about those environmental changes that affect the natural disasters. And Dalia talked about media and labeling. And if it bleeds, it leads. I think that, mitigation, when we speak of mitigation, we tend to look at it at the end of emergency management cycle. That's something that, in policy making, it's been documented that you sort of need the three things to intersect to have a window to bring certain issues to the front. And that typically happens after a focusing event, a large event or a disaster, when you have a huge public outcry, when you have a very strong media presence on the event, and when you have research that is supporting the public outcry and the media covering the event, and that's the window for policy making. So in mitigation, you would expect that the best time for mitigation would be right after response. So as soon as the response is in its final phases and the short-term recovery starts, that's where media is still there. That's where people are still upset about what happened. And that's, where the researchers are involved and get funding for research in that arena. Once all those strands sort of diverge down the road, this is when the policy window narrows. And this is generally when we get to mitigation and talking about it. It's at the very, very tail end. So it's not a very good sort of philosophical way of looking at it, or not very effective way of looking at mitigation. John mentioned, again, you went back to 1,300 people died in Katrina, people died on 9/11, but most of the funding was for counterterrorism. And big UASI initiatives, urban area security initiatives, certainly have focused on physical infrastructures. UASI grants do not focus on environment or community and societal resiliency. And then, with that, you see certain things like community response, emergent response, spontaneous response being disenfranchised, and also the cultural aspects of the community not being taken into account in recovery process or in mitigation practices. Okay, so some of the strategies for that, you talked about going back to mitigation, the tying out trailers in tornadoes and regulations that do help. And again, those regulations happen in the aftermath of the event. There has been, after the Deepwater Horizon, which is a big case study you might have in emergency management too, if you're taking it. After the Deepwater Horizon, there was immediately after it, there was a bill that was pushed towards the banning of the use of the Corexit, which was a dispersant used in the Gulf. And eventually, the bill sort of got lost in the pipeline. Once the event sort of drifted apart and the research was removed from the event, and the research on Corexit came about 2015, so about 5 years after the Deepwater Horizon, because that's a problem with research, it comes in much later from the event, and it's been the Corexit use is still problematic, and it's sort of, we're past that stage. So the last question that you discussed is, what do you consider a community change agent in emergency management today, and what kind of competencies those people would be expected to have, and how you would know that they do? And so you talked about, I think John mentioned the Peter Martin becoming the new emergency management coordinator for your area, who was engaged in Harvey through Coast Guard. And that's somebody that comes in with big vision, big stress on preparation and planning, introduces new ways of thinking. So certainly innovative thinking coming, from the, different system perspective. Kennedy talked about building competencies such as team building, experience, again, going back to the experience and expertise in domain knowledge, not necessarily being part of the events, but also being part of the investigation of aftermath and after action reports and learning of organizations, networking, coordinating and planning. And John mentioned that teamwork comes through being on the same page and working together. And I think that, you mentioned how, different agencies that are part of the emergency management have different and disparate interests. So somebody who's going to be a change agent is going to be somebody who can look across the system and be aware of those differences, that public health officials make decisions about allocations differently than, law enforcement deals with those events differently, and then politicians and politics comes into that as well, and somebody that's going to have that strategic visioning that is going to be able to account for all those differences and how people perceive risk, how they assess it. Type personalities in one room, I think. Dalia was talking about how to lead within a bureaucracy, critical thinking, creativity, and improvisation. Certainly in complexity, uncertainty that Crystal mentioned, that is a hallmark of our future emergencies and dealing with disasters. The ability to improvise and go into the gray area is really critical. We are conducting a study with Dr. Baker on Harvey, and we have identified that, the number one thing that always happens, and it's a normal dealing with bureaucratic structures, is what we call unstrapping. So people that actually are very aware of standard operating procedures, policies, and laws, but also know where and how to be able to bend them and adjust them. So people that have a flexibility of mind that, in a certain process, let's say the resource request process for Texas, which is, if you've ever seen the STAR chart, it's very complex, requires all the people in one room and all the people that have to sign, just the process takes about 20 minutes if you're all in one room. So now, back channel communications and stuff like that take place, and it's a natural process of dealing with bureaucracy in complex environments. So complexity leadership is going to be really critical, and people who can take risks in making certain decisions, and they can assess those risks wisely to where they, don't jeopardize lives, but they also look at the consequences of their decisions and can overcome bureaucracy. John says that, there's a lot happening in a gray area, and this sort of goes to the spirit of what I'm talking about. The unstrapping will happen. It's just how good somebody is at it will decide whether they get fired the next day or whether they truly be agent of change, right? Crystal talked about domain knowledge again, that, the change agents have to be knowledgeable. And I have to tell you that, there is a very strong shift towards the professionalization of emergency management with, people that need to be experts in, again, those things we talked about, predictive modeling and weather patterns and understanding economics and understanding politics and understanding changes in demographics and social factors and cultural intricacies. So there is going to be a lot more to the emergency manager of the future. As we talked about those, higher and higher expectations put on those organizations, the emergency management manager of the future will have to be a person with domain knowledge, with practical experience and with a good combination of the two, and somebody that is also very good at reaching out and liaising across the systems, that network of different constituencies that are part of this huge machinery of managing disasters. When hiring somebody, look at what they actually done. So evidence-based hiring, certainly, being able to articulate important decisions that were made in critical events by those professionals. You talked about role play and value of simulations and exercises and putting people in certain scenarios so they can actually evidence that they can shoot through problems, that they can have a mental simulation ability to project or think strategically. And Dalia talked about training together. So again, the joint training, that's always an issue because the funding streams typically go to silos. So the TEEX is going to train your firefighters, and then some other law enforcement institutes will train police officers, and the public health will get their funds to train their medical personnel or surveillance epidemiologists and so on and so forth. So a lot of times there's a lot of constraints in creating those multi-jurisdictional exercises and joint trainings and so on and so forth, but that's really, really critical. So creating scenarios where you actually have different actors with different expectations and different political constituencies is very critical. And I think Dalia again talked about reflective assessments. So yeah, unexamined practice is not worth doing. That's my motto. What are we doing with after action reports? That's a very interesting question. We do not have even nationally a joint database. We've got lesson learner information sharing, which is part of Homeland Security Digital Library, but for most people, they're not aware of it, they don't access it, they don't use it. So how do we make those platforms more accessible to emergency management professionals? And John mentioned the flexibility and the ability to practice mental simulation and having a situational awareness. And, that's true, that goes for decision making in crisis. The difference between good incident commanders and bad incident commanders is the level of situational awareness. So that goes to all those issues you talked about. You can display, and situational awareness is basically your understanding of your position in a particular context. So what to expect from whom and where they sit. I really like to explain situational awareness, or 3 levels of situational awareness. That's from the book by Klein on how people make decisions. Is that there is a situational awareness. One, let's imagine you're flying a plane and you're flying that plane from Chicago to New York. So your plane path, and your flight schedule, and who you've got in your cockpit, and who is on board and how many souls. And that's your situational awareness 1. Situational awareness 2 would be you not only know who is on board or what the flight leg is, but what are some other flight traffics at that time of the day on that route that you have flown. What are the typical weather patterns at that time of the year? What are possible issues with the weather? Who else is part of this equation? What happened before? What you expecting to do after you land, and so on and so forth. That's situational awareness 2. And situational awareness 3 is all those things, but you are also thinking about what would happen if one of those planes on this different path did this, or weather did that, or the birds got into the engine, or you had to be derouted, or you couldn't land in Chicago or New York. And so that's the situational awareness 3, where you sort of project and imagine all those different scenarios and take a much larger context. And you have to be extremely engaged to be always at that level of situational awareness free. And that's for, good emergency management professionals. So with that, I think that pretty much wraps up my assessment of your Google Hangout free. I'm looking forward to viewing your last one that you submitted. And thank you for your really nice work as a team on that and on coverage of materials. And thank you, John, for facilitating. See you on the next one.